my name is Dr. Catherine Brill. I am the CEO and co-founder of Neolth. Neolth provides mental health and stress support to students ages 14 plus by delivering on-demand personalized care on our self-guided platform. This session today is part of our webinar series around breaking down stigma and encouraging youth to reach out for mental health care and support when they need it. So I'm really excited to be here today with our two panelists, Naveen and Mariam. And Naveen, I was wondering if you could start by just briefly introducing yourself and your work.
Hi, yes, my name is Naveen, and I am a licensed marriage family therapist, and I've also done training in art therapy before. Currently, I work in addiction, and I have worked a lot with in psych hospitals, working with teenagers that have struggled with suicidal ideation and depression and anxiety.
Thanks so much, Naveen. We're really excited to have you today. Mariam, could you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Mariam. I am a graduate student at Palo Alto University. I'm currently studying clinical psychology, and I am working on a project incorporating UX design and psychology to create a more accessible and exclusive resources for the younger generation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bryn Drescher, and I am a mental performance coach. I work with professional, college, and high school athletes, primarily in the sport of basketball. I do have athletes in sports, like I've had an esports team. I've got volleyball players, track athletes. So it varies. It runs the gamut. I even had one cheerleader. And in general, it's my passion comes from this idea that, athletes are also people, and how you do anything is how you do everything. And so addressing the whole person, which includes their mental health, because the more that we can harness the power of our mind and break the myth that we only use a certain percentage of our brain. We're just only aware of a certain percentage of the use of our brain, but our brain is 100% working. And so just helping athletes be more, enhance their performance through the use of the mind, but also just enhance them as people, because the better off we can use our minds, the better people we are. So
today we're talking about breaking down stigma. And I was wondering if we could start with, what stigma means to you and how you think stigma impacts students. And Naveen, maybe you can kick us off.
So I think stigma means that there is a little bit of a blockage to receiving the help that people are looking for, because there's some sort of like negative connotation to mental health. Like there's something wrong with you. And I think culturally that can also be that can play a huge impact, because I think different cultures view mental health differently. And so even though I think that this generation and in the US, we've gotten a lot better at it, there's still a lot of other factors that play.
Thanks so much, Naveen. And Mariam, same question. What does stigma mean to you, and what are some of the ways you think that stigma impacts students regarding mental health?
Stigma plays such a huge role, especially in the student life. A lot of students, they struggle with mental health issues. And while we are progressing towards creating a more inclusive and accessible environment for these students, it still is very hard for them to be open and find the correct resources they need without the judgment that is masked behind it, especially in academia. So I feel like this generation is doing a really good job making it more normative and kind of just more easy for their peers to find the resources they need.
Yeah, I think there's it's kind of a multi-layered situation when you talk about the word stigma. Being a woman of color, that you can see, those of you that are watching this and can see that my face, I'm a Black woman, I'm actually biracial. And one of the things is it is very taboo in communities of color to sort of put an extra, mark against your race, so to speak, to be seen as somehow having some sort of mental health challenge. Also, like we're talking about, just people are not, I don't want to use the word ignorant, but just not informed about what mental health is. And as we, we'll talk about later, it's all the different modalities, right? So there's so much that goes into maintaining mental health, and so that it does not become mental illness, but people have those two completely connected. And so that's one of the stigmas. And then the labels, which I am finding, as not a licensed practitioner of psychology or psychiatry, but because I closely work with individuals in that field and respect them, that the labels were created to help with insurance and to help with treatment plan. But unfortunately, people are carrying those labels in such a way that it kind of creates some confusion for other people. And it's like, oh, so am I going to have that for life? Is this incurable? Is this a thing? And so I think it's just as a profession that we can help with that, which is sort of like, I don't need to be the doctor and you're the patient, but we're kind of people that are having a conversation, and how best to sort of, as a group and a team, to use a sports term, to sort of tackle this and help you, if not overcome it, manage it in a way that you still can live a very healthy life. And that's for those that have those labels / diagnoses. For those that don't, there may be things that, you're thinking that you are because you're reading WebMD or whatever. So sometimes it's just like this fear. And so we just have to, it's just more education, keep talking about it, normalizing it, more professionals coming out and saying, hey, this is happening to me too. I'm kind of going through a low period, or, I'm having a moment. And then people just sort of realizing that this just isn't something that we need to keep behind closed doors. And I want to say one other thing. I know I'm talking for a long time, but the term coming out of the closet, I know it applies, and especially since we're doing this in Pride Month, to the LGBTQ community, but I also want it to be a thing in some way in the mental health space, like being able to come out of the closet and say, yo, I'm doing this for my mental health, or I'm having a mental health challenge, and this is, and that's okay. So just like Naomi Osaka recently did. So
that's a great point, and something that we'll get to later in the conversation is storytelling and shared lived experiences and how important that is. But you also mentioned a whole lot there that I want to make sure that people remember. I think labels, like you said, was a lot around insurance and treatment. And I'm a neuroscientist, right? So we're even starting to find with the new research that even if somebody has the same diagnosis, like depression, for example, there might be completely different treatments that they respond to. Some person responds to medication, someone CBT, somebody brain stimulation. So even then, I start to wonder, like, well, how much do the diagnoses, how important is it? Do we need to put that label on? Is it oppressive to do that? So I think that's an important topic that you bring up, but also this idea of the spectrum of care of mental health and wellness, because we do have a really reactive model where we wait until people are sick, or in the schools we wait until people are in crisis, and then that's when they're getting help. But the prevention is really important, and that needs to be emphasized as well. And something else that you brought up was just culture and mental health for people of color. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about stigma, how culture plays a role, and also intersectionality. You mentioned it's Pride Month. So, sexual orientation, if that plays a role, or even gender, and just kind of the intersectionality of different identities, how that might be related to stigma.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much, right? Because obviously we know that the more of these, again, to use a term, labels, which are identities, we can also call it that, the more that I feel that we occupy within oneself, it becomes that much more challenging with mental health, because there's so much in the space of who am I? So as a person who is biracial, for example, I was raised by my white mother, single parent household. And so as someone who visibly is Black, in my opinion, right? But yet people were telling me the way that I talked or the way that I showed up was, maybe not in resonance with my appearance, if that makes sense, or the culture that I appeared to come from. And then I had the whole thing of feeling like I had to choose, but I only had one choice, but it was like still a choice. So it was weird. And so having all of that and feeling sort of like, where do I belong? What box am I fitting in? And I think, what's really important for the youth that might be listening or any educators is to really allow yourself to occupy any identity that is feeling resonant within you, but not to try to fit into anyone else's box or to check a box. That's so key for mental health. And the stigma that comes along with, or the idea that it would be a stigma if you have a challenge, like if you're struggling with that, finding your community, finding where you fit in, that's okay. It's okay not to be okay, or to be confused, or to feel lost at times. But I think the big thing is just to talk to someone, talk to anyone, and it's our job as people that might be supporting these youth or supporting in these roles, like I do with my athletes, is just to be a sounding board, to listen, but not necessarily to try to then put a label on that person to make them feel like they have to identify with that now, which is another, place to carry it. It's sort of like, well, here's what's helped me. Here's where I have found some, relief or solace in that situation, or a solution. I don't know if that'll work for you, but here's some resources. And so I think that's really the big thing about breaking it down, is just talking about it, and then knowing that we don't have to necessarily tie it up in a bow and go, this is what this is, because I think that just adds to another layer that the person is feeling like, well, I don't identify with that, so I don't know if that's going to work for me.
Oh, absolutely. This, I feel like, is a really important topic, especially growing up in the US, where mental health is viewed a little bit more as acceptable. However, there are a lot of dysphorias pocketed in different cultures throughout the US. So even though I would have been able to go to school and find the resources, they're not always accessible in every location, such as like at home. And for a lot of communities, it's still not accessible. And I don't think just culture plays a huge role in that stigma. I believe that gender plays an enormous role in that stigma. Me reaching out for help is a lot more normative than one of my male brothers reaching out for help. And on a more professional level, I noticed the reason, a little bit of background on me, that I'm working in UX design to create more resources that are inclusive, and a lot of that inclusivity has to do with the male gender, because looking at CBT journals, looking at audio apps for therapy, they're very girly, they're kind of not really inclusive. So I just feel like this is something that needs to be tackled a little bit more seriously, especially when it comes to gender and stigma around mental health.
Thanks, Mariam. I think that's a huge point, and it feels like it's the intersection of different identities. It's like culture and gender and different things that can come together to be barriers for accessing care. So you talked about culture, but then you also talked about your brothers and their gender and how that could be an additional barrier. Naveen, anything to add around culture or gender and how that might be a barrier or might create stigma for people around mental health?
Well, I think that personally, parents from like immigrant parents have a different idea of what mental health is. So I think that really affects first generation immigrants. So I think that plays a huge role in either not being able to share with them how you feel, or also feeling guilty for wanting to reach out, or feeling like there's something wrong with you because you can't handle the pressure or the pain or whatever that you're feeling.
Can you go into that a little bit deeper? I think you said something really important, which is feeling ashamed or feeling guilty about reaching out for care. And you're a therapist. What have you seen within your patients, or just different people that you've worked with? How does that kind of shame and that guilt influence their comfort level reaching out for mental health services or receiving mental health services?
So, I mean, if you think about just the emotion shame, it's not that it's a negative emotion, but if it's something that is continuously felt, it can really change the way that you interact in the world. So I think that if you're feeling shame for, which is I am bad, then you're not gonna think that anything is gonna help you. And then B, you're also not gonna want to reach out because you feel like nothing is gonna help you and no one's gonna understand you. So I feel like it's kind of like this spiraling way that you tend to live your life, which is really unhealthy.
So you mentioned, you're working with CBT apps and you felt like a lot of them were geared more towards people who are identifying as women than men within the UX design. And just wondering if you've ever felt like there might be a program that was geared more towards a certain culture. So for example, we've heard a lot with mindfulness apps that they're really geared towards people who are white and they don't always cater to people in the BIPOC community. Have you seen that before in your work? And how do you think we kind of overcome that or fix that issue?
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree with you. The BIPOC community is not addressed fully in a lot of these apps and a lot of programs as well. How do I think that we can make that more accessible? I'm not sure, honestly. My program is doing a little bit of cultural sensitivity and a little bit of cultural training, but it's not enough. And I don't feel like it's enough for a lot of programs. I really feel like the best way that this problem or this issue could be resolved is to find more BIPOC therapists and more professionals and more of these like employments and even UX design. They're not always translated. There's always a language barrier, and I mean, you really can't understand a culture completely until you're immersed in it. And I feel like we have taken the first step as a community to raise more awareness in like the millennials and in Gen Z to find the resources. And I'm sure it's only a matter of time before they too grow up and start to assimilate into the more professional role with helping others.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that you want to feel, because the experience of someone who is Caucasian is like very different than an experience of someone who's a minority, right? So I think if a minority person wants to go to therapy, they don't want to sit there and have to explain. And it's like hard for someone to understand, and it's no one's fault, but it's just really hard to really understand like the pressures from your parents, the guilt in the culture, the shame in the culture. So it's like you want someone that can understand like even what your limits are or as far you'll go with the relationships that you have in your life, right? So then I think it's important that more people from different cultural backgrounds like come into therapy and, or are involved in any way possible. And I think people are. I think that there's a lot more cultural diversity now.
Thanks. This has been a great conversation, and I think just covering some really important topics. So I appreciate you both just being here with me today and sharing your thoughts. One of the things that I wanted to talk about next was storytelling. So as you know, at Neolth in the company, we've recently released a new community section, and part of that is actually working with youth to tell their stories or their lived experience with mental health and use those experiences and stories to break down stigma. So Naveen, do you think that people sharing or talking about their lived experience, whether it's on an app or a group setting, can that be used to break down stigma?
I think so. I mean, this is sort of maybe not as related, but I was thinking about how, AA, like that's what people do is just like share their stories, and then other people feel like they can relate to it, and then they feel like they have someone that's gone through the same thing and that they can get better, So I think it's kind of the same concept of being able to share where you're going through, know that you're not alone, and then know that you can get better, or things can get better.
That's a great analogy. I hadn't actually thought of it like that with AA, but it does make a lot of sense. And Mariam, I'm just curious to hear from you, especially based on your experience with UX design. Have you seen this kind of storytelling woven into any of the products that you've worked with, or do you think that having young people, go on an app and like blog or do a video diary about their lived experience? Have you seen that before, or do you think that that's something that could be used to break down stigma?
Oh, absolutely. And I completely agree with the AA analogy. Telling your story is kind of therapy, and it definitely breaks down the stigma. I think a really great example of this would be, the most commonly used app, Instagram. There's lots of accounts like the Depression Project where people get on, they tell their story, they break down the stigmas, and it makes it easier for others to relate, to understand, to link themselves to something that's more grounding and not superficial and easy for them to, relate to and understand. So I feel like these things are already blossoming in like regular apps. There are obviously other apps as well, but I believe that Instagram, Twitter, the Depression Project, My Self-Love Supply, like all those companies are doing a really amazing job with storytelling. And the Gen Z generation is taking great strides with it as well.
Well, I think the other thing to break down, and I didn't mention this when I introduced myself because I do multiple things, but I am a speaker and I do work in the school district here in Los Angeles at LAUSD. So I have experience with youth that are athletes and I have experience with youth that are not athletes. So I think the big thing is a colleague of mine gave me this little phrase or sentence, and it's always really spoke to me. You can't correct until you can connect. And so the big thing is when it comes to any kind of title, which, I'm a doctor, I'm a mental performance coach. I think they're all wonderful and lovely. And, of course, I never want to take anything away from those that have earned, their stripes, so to speak. But I think it's really important to always connect human to human. And so And when I'm talking to the young people, their whole thing is, I don't know if this person knows anything about my life. So you find a lot of times, like you go to these school districts and a lot of the teachers don't represent the populations that they serve. And that's not a knock against those teachers for taking those jobs. It's just something that happens. So then those youth that have that experience often will relay a situation where it's like, I don't know if I feel comfortable talking to them because how do they know what it's like to walk a mile in my shoes as a person of color? Because a lot of the schools that we service are schools and communities of color. And so the predominantly Latino and a small portion of African American and even smaller portion of Caucasian, and obviously Asian and other ethnicities and races in the mix. So it's very interesting to see that, and then have those students feel like, well, I don't know, like I might be from another country, I might be new here, and I don't know where I identify. So I think breaking down those stigmas is to really do our job to extend the handout, and to across the aisle, so to speak, but to allow for that to say, okay, well, what do I need to do to make sure that these people can feel heard, they feel seen, and they feel represented? And I think that, doing our best to make sure that saying like, okay, well, if this person doesn't feel comfortable talking to me, then what is another teacher that I could bring in to these sessions, or, and in a healthy way, of course. And I understand some people that's out of their depth, but I do find that, like what you said, that reactionary thing is a big thing. Like, I don't need to be in crisis to go talk to somebody. And so I think it's just, again, normalizing it, making it embedded into what we do. And so those students really see that and that person is like, once a week coming into their class, having that interaction with them. So they realize that it doesn't have to be that if I don't look like you, that I can't help you, if that makes sense.
That does make a lot of sense. And you said something that I feel like really resonated with me, but you wanted the youth to be heard and to be seen. And part of that, it sounds like, is having those conversations with them. But I wonder how much part of that could also be co-creation. This is something we've seen, you know, as the creator of a digital app, where we really work closely every week with students and ask them how to build this and what the content should look like. And I'm wondering if that's something that we should see more in the schools when they're thinking about mental health programs or programs to implement, if they should actually bring the kids and get them involved in the conversation. And if you have any thoughts about that.
No, absolutely. And I think it's important that the terminology is done in a way that is on their level, and not to say that they don't have great vocabularies and very intelligent, but also to make sure we're not speaking in any clinical terms, and sometimes even taking some of the terms that we are comfortable with that we don't think. So it's sort of like, you know, polling your audience and saying, okay, so what makes you happy? What would you like to see more of in your school? And sometimes they don't have an answer. So it's like, you know, obviously for the survey experts and all the, you know, those sociologists and people that do all that work to know how to break down those surveys. But I think, yeah, absolutely. I think students need a huge role in their education and their mental health addressing, because it's a lot of like, sort of like, this is what we're giving you. And then they sort of feel like, well, just from the way that we approach education, it's not it's unsurprising that the students feel like we don't listen to them, or we don't really care to hear what they have to say. And so in the way that we go about things, we just need to be more cognizant of at least taking, you know, not just asking for their feedback, but then making it clear that it was incorporated into what was created. So it's like, oh, you know, 70% of what we created came from the students themselves, like being, you know, making that a big part of the rollout, so that they're like, yeah, I actually, you know, I actually gave that idea. Because obviously ownership of one's mental health journey or health journey, because again, we don't need to just add the word mental, is huge. And then obviously you're going to have more efficacy in the results. So
I had one question that was, I think, more specific for you, Mariam, but just based on your background, I know you've done your background in neuroscience, and you've done some research in Alzheimer's, if I'm correct. Was curious if you think that there are any, and there's a difference in stigma. We kind of separate disorders with, you know, mental illness and psychology, and there's stigma around that. But then there's neurology and kind of those subset of disorders. Do you think there's a difference between the stigma and help-seeking behavior in psychology and neurology?
Oh, absolutely. There's definitely a difference in that stigma. I feel like the biomarkers are a really big thing for the current community and population that we're dealing with. They like being able to see physical data of what's going on. And so I understand how it can be harder to relate some of like the mental health illnesses that we can't really get biomarkers for. And I believe that creates a lot of stigma. I definitely have seen it before. Just because, you know, we don't have biomarkers for it yet doesn't mean that they're not equal in their severity or in like their importance. So I can understand where the stigma comes from. I really hope, you know, slowly we start to break it down with research, with data, with stats, with just general awareness, education, and academics, and hopefully break down that stigma. I understand where it comes from, but I believe education is the key to starting somewhere.
Yeah, you bring up a great point with the biomarkers. I think when you have something like, you know, protein or a marker where you can pick that up on a PET scan, it feels like, okay, there's something physical behind this health condition, but it's different within mental health. And it's really exciting to see some of the new brain imaging research coming out around functional connectivity, or even just structural differences, and how we can maybe use those as biomarkers for conditions like depression or conditions like anxiety. So looking forward to seeing the advances in neuroscience over the next few years. I know you do a lot of work with athletes, and we've been hearing more from student athletes, or I think it's just, you know, additional pressure, and it's really hard, I think, for them to try to balance being an athlete and maybe trying to get a scholarship and be in school. So just curious, based on your work, you know, what you've seen athletes do to take care of their health, and what maybe sports teams can do to break down stigma on their team.
Yeah, it just goes back to the same thing. I know I sound like a broken record, but with the recent situation with, and Naomi Osaka is not a part of a team, just so we're clear, but she is part of the U.S. tennis. Oh, no, sorry, she's not. She represents Japan. But the point is that in general, the athletes have this, we know as in child development, we do a reward system. And, when you're good, you get praised. And when you're bad, sometimes you get punished. And there's, notwithstanding any restorative justice programs and efforts to sort of change some of that. But there's a lot that's programmed through the school system of like good, bad. So then you go to the sports world and it's like, look, if I have a good game, I'm great. Everybody loves me. If I don't have a good game, I'm disappointed in myself. I feel like I let my whole family down, all that. And so the athlete tries to take all of this in the midst of still processing, growing up, figuring out who they are. And then they have this identity of being an athlete. And so their whole worth and world is tied up in that space. So when we talk about stigma, for them, it's like, they're putting a lot of pressure on themselves. They are creating certain situations in their minds and their bodies, but they're not necessarily seeing that as, let me go talk to somebody about it. It's like, I've got to manage this because sports is all about suck it up, buttercup. Got to play through, play strong. And so there's a lot of that conversation. And so when we talk about destigmatizing, it's like, it's okay not to be okay. Hey, do you need a moment to talk about this? Asking more questions instead of telling athletes how they feel and telling them how they should feel. I think there's a lot of that. Just seeing what happened this week with Naomi, it's like she used the word mental health and people are like, you don't have a mental health challenge because they know, right, what's going on with her. And so I think it's an invisible injury, as they call it. So it's this challenge for the athlete. And so destigmatizing is just, again, embedding it into everything you do, talking about it, making it a part. I make it a part of my calls with my athletes. We check in, we talk about how was your week? What's going on for you, and letting them know, like, when they get frustrated, hey, that's normal. You don't want to practice today? That's okay. How you feeling? Let's see what level can you give? What's the best thing you can offer? And here's some steps how we can maybe walk it up to a level that might help you. Because if you're feeling down and a bad performance is going to make you feel even worse, let's talk about how we can maybe just get a better performance out of a day like today. So I think it's really important and to have that, and it's great that, everybody says we need to give it to the youth earlier. But then it comes back to a resource situation. So I think coach training, since they're going to have the coach anyway, embedding it into that so that coach can be a place of at least some healthier talk around that space and sort of embedding it into their coaching in the absence of a mental health professional that they can have access to due to limited resources, particularly in low income communities. So.
Thank you. I think that's really important in an area where I'm, again, starting to see more interest from a lot of the students, but not a lot of people talking about it, what's going on with the health of the athletes and how do we break down stigma on the team. So that advice around including the coach, I think, is really important because it's, like you said, might not necessarily be the doctor that they're reaching out to because there are some barriers there, and it's whoever they're feeling comfortable with and safe with, and that could oftentimes be the coach. So, one of the things that we were talking about was how different generations kind of view mental health or have different levels of comfort with mental health. And Gen Z is a generation that we're finding, seems to be much more engaged in mental health and talking about it and seeking help. So Bryn, maybe we can start with you. Anything that you've noticed about Gen Z and their approach to mental health or stigma?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think that the younger generation is definitely more open to talking about things in general, right? We all come from times where, mental health was something that is, like you use the word stigma. And I think that it has gotten better. Where I think that we're still a little bit of a gap is like still kind of confusing mental health with mental illness. And so since I work with athletes in particular, a lot of times when I ask them just about like their mental game or just mental health in general, they're like, oh no, I'm good. I don't have any problems. And you're like, well, that's not exactly what I'm talking about. So I find that there's definitely a lot more anxiety and certain things that they're diagnosed. So they're more familiar with some clinical terms as well as just in general, just kind of like, oh yeah, I have this, I have that, I deal with this, but I don't find it to be as under, sort of like, it's sort of like, okay, I have this, but they don't really know exactly where to go with that sometimes. And so, and still there's a little bit of like, when you put a doctor in front of them, for example, because I'm not a doctor or a licensed practitioner, they often will, shy away and feel that that's not like, oh, I don't need that, and so, or some people are more driven to that, especially if they're, they need medication or something like that. So that's been my experience with the Gen Zers.
Thanks so much. That's great insight. And Mariam, anything that you'd love to add around just what you've seen Gen Z and mental health and stigma?
I completely understand how it can be very intimidating for Gen Z in a clinical setting, but I believe they're doing a really great job in the digital setting, breaking down stigmas online, on Instagram, on Twitter, speaking up for what they believe is right. I have definitely seen that, and they're doing amazing compared to any generation that's preceded them. And I really hope that, it becomes normative in the future. I feel like we're getting there slowly.
What's one action that you think education or health professionals can take to break down stigma for youth?
So Gen Z has already started by doing mental health checks on their friends. They're making this very normal. They're doing it all the time. And I believe the one action that we can take in education and healthcare is to not only require physicals of students to come back into school, but to do routine mental health checks. I believe it's a huge part of health that we're missing out on. We've only made therapy accessible when students need it, and I feel like it should be routine. It should be annual. They should be doing this at least annually. So I believe a mental health or a mental wellness check should be incorporated into the lives of students.
Yeah, definitely. I think at the high school level, we're starting to see that a little bit more. But Bryn, anything that you want to add around what you think professionals can do to break down stigma for youth?
Yes, I could not agree more with what Mariam was saying. I think just adding another layer to it is, and what came to mind was, I think we're at the place now where we have this nutrition plate where they talk about the 4 quadrants or whatever. We need to have that, and like maybe even removing the word mental health, like just making it health in general and making it like the plate. Here's the 4 quadrants, physical, mental, emotional, whatever, and we just kind of address that on a general basis, because I think that having school psychologists, I know there's not a lot of funding because I work in the education space as well, and it's like, sometimes they're spread between like large campuses, there's only one, and then you have school counselors and then social workers and you have all that. So I think since they are strapped resource-wise, some districts and stuff, we just need to make it embedded in instead of always just like, hey, if you need this, come talk to me. And so because we're finding out more and more that the students do have a lot that they need and they do want someone to talk to. And so in the sports space, we talk about like, a lot of schools on the college level have a sports psychologist, but it's still that stigma of, oh, that's a doctor, I don't need that. So I think just making it something like, hey, today we're addressing mental health in practice. Today we're addressing basically what Mariam was saying, just generally embedding it into the curriculum, into the programming, so that it's not a separate apart. And so they're like, oh yeah, we have a school psychologist. And I talked to a Gen Zer last night, one of my clients, and she was saying that we had mental health days, mental health Mondays, and that was awesome. And she loved it. She looked forward to it. Also the perk of missing class, to be honest, but she was, but that was something that she mentioned herself. So I think that having that, making it normal, introducing them to all the different types and modalities that they could be exposed to, like dancing and, you know, yoga and all the different ways that it looks, so it doesn't look like a one size fits all approach, and they can kind of pick and choose how they feed their mental health, I think is just so important. And we need to support anything that could help that happen as schools.
Wow, you just said so much that I want to unpack, because I think I love the idea of the nutritional plate. I'm an integrative specialist, so, you know, we use the term mental health because that's what people know, but I always felt like, oh, why are we using that, or mind body? Like, why is it not just one, you know? Because it is. It's health, physical health, mental health. It all blends together. So I think that's a really important point in starting to move towards kind of getting rid of maybe some of this outdated terminology. I think we have a long way to go. But another thing that you said that was really important was giving anybody, but especially the kids, like leeway to choose what works for them. I hear a lot of times, especially from young people, I need to do what's popular, like a mindfulness or a CBT, like that's what's popular. And like, well, that's the only thing that's going to work because that's the only thing I've heard of. And there's so many other things. You talked about sports, you talked about dance, movement. We have things like creative art, guided imagery. We have lots of different therapeutic types on our platform. And what's really interesting is that we see somewhere between 50 and 60% of the students on our platform say, I want to use all types. They don't just want mindfulness or breathing exercises. So really understanding the variety of things you can do for your mental health and finding what works for you is really important. Mariam, I know that you're going to jump off in a second. Any closing words that you'd like to share with us just around, you know, stigma and mental health for youth?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a really productive conversation that I'm going to keep with me. I think that we're doing a really great job as professionals to break down the stigmas and the barriers. I do know that we have a long way to go, but everyone starts somewhere. And I feel like us as professionals and the Gen Z generation that's coming up is going to do some really amazing things.
You know, as we're coming to a close here, anything else that you'd like to add around just stigma for youth and breaking that down?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to that piece of identity. I talk about it a lot with my athletes, and I think it doesn't just apply to athletics. It happens for anyone who has a significant amount of their personhood wrapped up in something, a label, is challenging for that person if it ever goes away through an injury for an athlete, through a change of, like, I was a student, I was a great student, and then something happened and I'm no longer getting good grades. You know, I was a part of this community and then I fell out with my friends and now no one's talking to me. So now I don't know who I am, I'm lost. Or I want to change where I stand in this world, but if I leave this place, who am I? Where, you know, am I going to be alone? And so I think it is just letting the youth know that that's going to change. You're going to change hats like thousands of times. But the key, and what I attempt to work with the youth, when I work with the youth, in whether it be in sports or out of sports, to emphasize is that your personhood cannot be affected. You are awesome and you are amazing, and you plug that in to whatever you do. The thing you plug it into isn't the thing that makes you awesome. So it's not, you're not awesome because you're a part of that community. You're not awesome because that community is awesome because you're a part of it. That, you know, so like you're adding and enhancing whatever you do. And so I think just helping them realize that the core of who they are is valuable, and identifying what strengths make them good at those roles and places that they tap into, because there's so many different things. Like, you know, even in the midst of this call, you know, I may be a coach, but I'm also a daughter. I'm also a sister. I'm also a partner. You know, I'm a friend. So I have all these different things, but there's a lot of what makes me great that I bring to all of those places. And so I usually have them work backwards and say, like, what's great about you that makes you a great friend? What makes you a great sister? So I think that breaking down those stigmas, again, is communication, talking about it openly, embedding it into the world, you know, wherever world they're in, and just making those resources available. And like you said, diversifying those offerings so that they have like a menu to choose. I look at it as a toolbox, right? Like you can pull it out. I got to do art today because that's what's really feed my soul. I feel like I need to dance on the sand at the beach, whatever it is. And so I think it's just those different things, but knowing that there is no one right path to the top of the mountain of mental health or health in general. There's just what works for you. And so be open to that and know that what works for one person doesn't work for everybody. And so you're not wrong if you don't feel comfortable meditating. And it's normal for your mind to wander. Just find what works for you and then work the heck out of it.
Absolutely. Right. So many great insights, and thank you so much, Bryn, for being here with us today. And thank you everyone who is watching. We really appreciate you joining in.